Have you ever wondered how a small city on the Tiber went from mud brick huts to ruling the Mediterranean and shaping the world for centuries? Rome did not simply unstayen. Rome was built through ambition, political invention, and wars that changed the fate of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. This is the full saga of the Roman Empire, from the legend of Romulus and Remus to the real power plays that turned a fragile republic into an engine of conquest. You will meet the architects of Rome's rise, generals who gambled everything, senators who destroyed rivals with laws and daggers, and emperors who demanded devotion like gods. But Rome's story is not only triumph, it is the price of winning. Civil wars that bled the republic dry, provinces squeezed for wealth, and armies that stopped serving the state and started serving the man who paid them. The same forces that made Rome unstoppable also planted the seeds of its collapse. And when Rome finally fell, it did not just end an era, it rearranged the map of history. The languages we speak, the laws we use, the roads we still follow, even the idea of citizenship and government, Rome's fingerprints are everywhere. If you enjoy stories like this, please like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next epic journey through history. The story begins in the mists of legend, around 753 BCE, on 7 hills beside the Tiber River in central Italy. According to Roman mythology, twin brothers named Romulus and Remus were abandoned as infants and miraculously saved by a she-wolf who nursed them back to health. These brothers would grow up to found a city that would one day rule the Mediterranean world. While modern historians recognize this tale as myth, it reveals something profound about how Romans understood their own identity. They saw themselves as survivors, as people who could thrive in harsh conditions and overcome impossible odds. The historical reality of Rome's founding was far more complex than this dramatic origin story suggests. Archaeological evidence reveals that the area around the 7 hills was inhabited by various Italian tribes for centuries before Rome emerged as a distinct settlement. The Latins, who would become the Romans, were just one of many groups living in the Italian peninsula alongside the Etruscans to the north, the Samnites to the east, and numerous other tribes scattered throughout the region. What made early Rome unique was its strategic location. Positioned at the first practical crossing point of the Tiber River, about 15 miles inland from the Mediterranean Sea, Rome naturally became a trading hub where merchants and travelers from different regions converged. The 7 hills provided natural defensive positions, while the fertile plains of Latium offered excellent agricultural opportunities. This geographical advantage would prove crucial to Rome's eventual dominance. During its earliest centuries, Rome was ruled by kings who governed with the advice of a senate composed of elder patricians from the most powerful families. These kings were not absolute monarchs, but rather military and religious leaders who relied on the support of Rome's aristocratic class to maintain their authority. The last of these kings, Tarquin the Proud, became so tyrannical that the Roman nobility revolted against him in 509 BCE, establishing the Roman Republic and swearing never again to allow one man to hold absolute power over their city. The Roman Republic that emerged from this revolution created one of history's most innovative governmental systems. Power was divided among multiple institutions to prevent any individual or group from accumulating too much authority. 2 consuls served as chief executives for 1-year terms, sharing power and checking each other's decisions. The Senate provided continuity and wisdom through its experienced members, while various assemblies allowed different segments of the population to participate in governance. This system reflected the Romans' deep suspicion of concentrated power and their commitment to collective decision-making. The phrase Senatus Populusque Romanus, meaning the Senate and people of Rome, became the official motto of the Republic, emphasizing that legitimate authority came from both the aristocratic Senate and the broader citizen body. This balance between elite expertise and popular participation would influence Republican governments throughout history. Yet, the early Roman Republic faced constant military threats that tested its new political system. The Italian peninsula was crowded with competing peoples, each struggling for territory and resources. The Etruscans, who had previously dominated central Italy, viewed Rome's growing power with alarm. The Gauls from the north launched devastating raids that sometimes reached Rome itself. Various Italian tribes formed coalitions to resist Roman expansion, while Greek colonies in southern Italy possessed superior military technology and naval power. These challenges forced Rome to develop exceptional military capabilities. Unlike many ancient armies that relied primarily on aristocratic warriors or hired mercenaries, Rome created a citizen militia system that could mobilize large numbers of disciplined soldiers. Roman citizens were organized into centuries based on their wealth and age, with each century responsible for providing specific types of troops and equipment. This system ensured that Rome could field substantial armies while maintaining the loyalty of its soldiers through their direct stake in the community's success. The Roman military's effectiveness came not just from numbers, but from superior organization and tactics. Roman soldiers fought in tight formations called maniples that could adapt to different terrain and enemy strategies. They carried standardized equipment including the gladius short sword and scutum shield, while engineers built camps, roads, and siege equipment with remarkable efficiency. Roman discipline was legendary, with severe punishments for cowardice or insubordination balanced by generous rewards for valor and service. As Rome's military power grew, so did its territorial ambitions. The Romans developed a sophisticated approach to conquest that combined military force with diplomatic skill. Rather than simply destroying defeated enemies, Rome often offered them various forms of alliance and citizenship that created incentives for cooperation. Some conquered peoples received full Roman citizenship. Others became Latin allies with partial rights, and still others were granted local autonomy in exchange for military service and tribute. This flexible approach to integration allowed Rome to absorb diverse populations without triggering constant rebellions. Former enemies could become Romans themselves, bringing their own skills and knowledge into the growing Roman system. Greek intellectual traditions, Etruscan religious practices, Gallic metalworking techniques, and countless other cultural elements enriched Roman civilization through this process of selective assimilation. The conquest of Italy took nearly 3 centuries of almost constant warfare. Each victory brought new challenges as Rome faced increasingly powerful enemies and complex political situations. The Samnite Wars, fought between 343 and 290 BCE, demonstrated Rome's ability to persist through temporary defeats and learn from military setbacks. The war against Pyrrhus of Epirus showed Roman determination against a brilliant Hellenistic general who won battles but could not break Roman resolve. By 270 BCE, Rome controlled the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po River, transforming itself from a city-state into the dominant power of the Mediterranean world. This rapid expansion created unprecedented wealth and opportunities for Roman citizens, but it also generated new social tensions and political conflicts. The traditional agricultural economy that had sustained early Rome could not accommodate the vast influx of slaves, tribute, and luxury goods that conquest provided. Small farmers found themselves unable to compete with large estates worked by slave labor, while urban populations swelled with displaced rural citizens seeking employment and sustenance. The Roman elite, meanwhile, accumulated enormous fortunes through provincial governorships, military commands, and commercial ventures that stretched across the Mediterranean. These wealthy families built magnificent houses, sponsored elaborate public entertainments, and competed for political honors through increasingly expensive campaigns. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically, creating social pressures that would eventually challenge the Republic's political stability. Despite these internal strains, Rome's expansion continued relentlessly. The conquest of Italy had only whetted Roman appetites for further territorial gains, while the wealth and manpower of the peninsula provided the resources necessary for even more ambitious military campaigns. The stage was set for Rome's emergence as a true world power, ready to challenge the established Mediterranean empires and reshape the ancient world according to its own vision of order and civilization. The transformation of Rome from a regional Italian power to master of the Mediterranean would unfold over the next 2 centuries through a series of epic conflicts that tested every aspect of Roman society. These wars would produce legendary heroes and villains, demonstrate the strengths and weaknesses of republican institutions, and ultimately set the stage for the Republic's transformation into the empire that would dominate the Western world for another 1,000 years. The Mediterranean world of the 3rd century BCE was dominated by powers far older and more established than Rome. Carthage controlled vast trading networks across North Africa and Spain, its merchant fleets carrying precious goods between distant ports, while its armies, led by skilled generals and supported by war elephants, had never known defeat by a European enemy. In the east, the successor kingdoms of Alexander's empire still commanded immense resources and military expertise that had conquered from Egypt to India. These were civilizations with centuries of accumulated wealth, sophisticated administrative systems, and cultural achievements that made Rome appear as little more than an ambitious upstart. Yet Rome possessed qualities that its enemies consistently underestimated. Where other powers relied on professional armies or mercenary forces, Rome could mobilize the entire manpower of Italy through its alliance system. Where other states treated warfare as a seasonal activity conducted by specialists, Romans viewed military service as a civic duty that every citizen owed to the community. Most importantly, where other civilizations sought to limit conflict and preserve existing arrangements, Romans approached war with a totality of commitment that shocked their opponents. The First Punic War erupted in 264 BCE when Rome intervened in a conflict on the island of Sicily. What began as a limited engagement to protect Roman allies quickly escalated into a 23-year struggle that would determine whether Rome or Carthage would control the Western Mediterranean. The Romans found themselves fighting a completely different kind of war than they had ever experienced before. Carthage's strength lay not in pitched battles on Italian soil, but in naval supremacy that allowed Carthaginian forces to strike anywhere along the Mediterranean coast while remaining supplied from secure bases in North Africa and Spain. Rome's response demonstrated the adaptability and determination that would characterize its approach to every major challenge. Despite having virtually no naval tradition, the Romans decided to build a fleet that could challenge Carthage at sea. Roman engineers studied captured Carthaginian warships, then constructed hundreds of King Karims using mass production techniques that prioritized quantity and standardization over individual craftsmanship. When Roman seamanship proved inferior to Carthaginian expertise, Roman inventors developed the corvus, a boarding bridge that allowed Roman soldiers to turn naval battles into infantry combat where their superior training and discipline could decide the outcome. The war's decisive moment came in 241 BCE when the Roman fleet finally achieved naval supremacy off the Aegates Islands. Carthage, exhausted by decades of conflict and facing rebellion among its African subjects, sued for peace and abandoned Sicily to Roman control. Rome had won its first overseas province and demonstrated that no power, however established or sophisticated, could resist Roman determination indefinitely. But victory over Carthage only intensified Roman ambitions and Carthaginian resentment. The peace treaty imposed harsh terms on Carthage, including massive indemnity payments that crippled the Carthaginian economy and restrictions on naval activity that undermined Carthage's traditional commercial dominance. When Carthaginian mercenaries rebelled due to unpaid wages, Rome exploited the crisis to seize Sardinia and Corsica, further humiliating its defeated rival and ensuring that future conflict was inevitable. Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian general who had never lost a battle during the First Punic War, devoted the remainder of his life to preparing for renewed conflict with Rome. He established Carthaginian power in Spain, building new armies from Spanish tribes while developing the silver mines that would finance future wars. His son-in-law Hasdrubal continued this expansion, founding New Carthage as a secure base for Carthaginian operations in the Western Mediterranean. But it was Hamilcar's son Hannibal who would transform these preparations into the greatest threat Rome had ever faced. Hannibal Barca possessed a strategic vision that transcended conventional approaches to warfare. Rather than accepting Carthage's inferior position and seeking limited gains through negotiation, he conceived a plan to destroy Roman power entirely by striking at the heart of Rome's alliance system in Italy itself. If he could demonstrate that Rome could not protect its allies, if he could inflict sufficient casualties on Roman armies, and if he could maintain his own forces in enemy territory long enough, the Italian confederation that was the source of Roman strength might collapse entirely. The Second Punic War began in 218 BCE, when Hannibal crossed the Alps with an army of nearly 100,000 men, including the famous war elephants that captured ancient imagination. This march through supposedly impassable mountain terrain in winter conditions demonstrated Hannibal's tactical genius and the extraordinary discipline of his multinational army. When he emerged into the Po Valley, he had lost nearly half his force to cold, hunger, and hostile tribes. But he had achieved complete strategic surprise and positioned himself to exploit the discontent of recently conquered Gallic tribes in northern Italy. Hannibal's early victories shocked Rome and its allies with their completeness and tactical sophistication. At the Trebia River, he used the harsh winter conditions and Roman impetuosity to lure a consular army into a carefully prepared ambush. At Lake Trasimene, he demonstrated his mastery of terrain by destroying an entire Roman army in a fog-bound valley, where Roman discipline and organization became liabilities rather than advantages. These defeats cost Rome over 30,000 casualties and revealed that traditional Roman tactics were inadequate against Hannibal's innovative approaches. The disaster at Cannae in 216 BCE represented the culmination of Hannibal's tactical genius and the nadir of Roman military fortune. Facing a massive Roman army of over 80,000 men, commanded by both consuls, Hannibal employed a double envelopment that surrounded and destroyed nearly the entire Roman force. The casualties included one consul, numerous senators, and thousands of Rome's most experienced soldiers. It was the worst military defeat in Roman history, and it brought Hannibal closer to ultimate victory than any foreign enemy had ever come. Yet, even this catastrophic loss could not break Roman determination or dissolve the alliance system that Hannibal sought to destroy. The Roman Senate refused Carthaginian peace overtures, declaring that Rome would never negotiate while enemy forces remained on Italian soil. New armies were raised from the remaining population, while allies who had wavered after Cannae were either coerced back into loyalty or systematically punished for their defection. Most crucially, the Romans adopted a new strategic approach under the dictator Fabius Maximus, avoiding major battles while harassing Hannibal's forces and cutting his supply lines. This Fabian strategy transformed the war's character from a series of dramatic confrontations into a grueling contest of endurance and resources. Hannibal found himself trapped in southern Italy with a shrinking army and no secure base, while Roman forces gradually recaptured territories that had defected to Carthage. The Romans also opened new theatres of conflict in Spain and North Africa, forcing Carthage to divide its limited resources and preventing reinforcements from reaching Hannibal when he needed them most. The war's turning point came not in Italy, but in Spain, where young Publius Cornelius Scipio demonstrated the tactical innovations and strategic vision that would ultimately defeat Hannibal himself. Scipio studied Carthaginian methods, adopted their flexible formations and cavalry tactics, and combined these with traditional Roman discipline to create armies that could match Hannibal's forces on equal terms. His conquest of New Carthage in a single day showed Romans that Carthaginian power was not invincible, while his systematic destruction of Carthaginian armies in Spain eliminated the resources that might have sustained Hannibal's campaign in Italy. By 207 BCE, Hannibal's situation had become desperate. His brother Hasdrubal finally arrived from Spain with reinforcements, but Roman intelligence intercepted the message, revealing their planned meeting point. At the Battle of the Metaurus River, Roman forces destroyed Hasdrubal's army and killed the general himself. When Hannibal learned of his brother's death, through the grisly discovery of Hasdrubal's severed head thrown into his camp, he reportedly wept for the first time since childhood, knowing that his dreams of conquering Rome had died with his brother. Scipio's bold decision to invade North Africa in 204 BCE forced Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend their homeland. The two greatest generals of their age finally met at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, where Scipio's superior cavalry and tactical adaptations proved decisive. Hannibal's war elephants were turned against his own forces, while Roman allied cavalry prevented the encircling maneuvers that had brought Carthaginian victory at Cannae. For the first time in his career, Hannibal tasted defeat, and with it came the end of Carthage as a major power. The Second Punic War's conclusion marked Rome's emergence as the dominant force in the Mediterranean world. Carthage was stripped of its empire, its fleet, and its ability to wage war without Roman permission. The victory brought unprecedented wealth flowing into Rome through indemnities, tribute, and the spoils of conquest. Roman soldiers returned home with stories of distant lands and exotic treasures, while Roman merchants began establishing trading networks that stretched from Spain to Egypt. Yet this triumph came at enormous cost to Roman society itself. 16 years of warfare had devastated the Italian countryside, destroyed countless farms, and displaced rural populations who crowded into Rome seeking survival. The citizen farmers who had formed the backbone of the Roman military found their fields ruined and their livestock slaughtered, while wealthy Romans used slave labor from conquered territories to establish vast agricultural estates that small farmers could never hope to compete against. The influx of wealth and slaves fundamentally altered Roman economic structures and social relationships. Traditional Roman values of frugality, self-reliance, and civic duty seemed increasingly irrelevant in a world where military service brought opportunities for enrichment beyond anything previous generations had imagined. The old patrician families found themselves competing with new men who had accumulated fortunes through military commands and provincial governorships, while the growing urban population demanded entertainment and subsidies that strained public resources. Rome's victory over Carthage also drew the Republic inexorably into conflicts with the Hellenistic kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean. Greek cities and rulers, impressed by Rome's defeat of Hannibal, began requesting Roman intervention in their own disputes with rival powers. What began as limited assistance to Greek allies gradually escalated into full-scale wars against Macedonia, Syria, and other successor states of Alexander's empire that possessed military traditions and resources far exceeding anything Rome had previously encountered. The Macedonian Wars revealed both the strengths and limitations of Roman military power when confronted with sophisticated opponents who understood Greek tactical innovations and possessed decades of experience fighting other professional armies. The Macedonian phalanx, with its forest of 20-foot pikes, initially proved devastating against Roman legions trained for combat with Italian tribes using shorter weapons and looser formations. At Cynocephali, in 197 BCE, only the flexibility of the manipular system and the individual initiative of Roman soldiers prevented complete disaster when the phalanx began to break Roman lines. Roman adaptation to Greek warfare demonstrated the intellectual curiosity, and practical problem-solving that characterized Roman responses to every major challenge. Roman commanders studied Greek military manuals, hired Greek military engineers and siege specialists, and modified their own tactical systems to incorporate the most effective elements of Hellenistic warfare. The Roman legion evolved from a primarily infantry force designed for fighting Italian hill tribes into a combined arms organization capable of coordinating infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineering units in complex operations across diverse terrain. The conquest of Greece and Macedonia brought Roman armies into contact with Greek culture, philosophy, and artistic achievement that would profoundly influence Roman intellectual development. Roman soldiers and commanders encountered libraries, theatres, and schools that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and artistic refinement. Greek slaves, many of them educated intellectuals captured during the wars, became tutors in wealthy Roman households, introducing Latin literature to Greek literary forms and Roman law to Greek philosophical concepts. This cultural exchange created tensions within Roman society between those who embraced Greek learning as a means of intellectual advancement and those who viewed Greek influence as a corrupting force that threatened traditional Roman values. Cato, the elder, exemplified conservative resistance to Hellenization, arguing that Greek philosophy undermined Roman military virtues and that Greek luxury corrupted Roman simplicity. His famous declaration that Carthage must be destroyed reflected not only strategic concerns, but also anxiety that Roman success was creating conditions that might ultimately destroy Roman character itself. The Syrian war against Antiochus III demonstrated Rome's growing confidence in projecting military power across vast distances, while managing complex diplomatic relationships with numerous allied states. Antiochus, who styled himself the Great in imitation of Alexander, commanded resources from modern-day Turkey to Afghanistan and possessed war elephants, cataphracts, and siege equipment that represented the pinnacle of Hellenistic military technology. His invasion of Greece in 192 BCE appeared to offer Romans their greatest challenge since Hannibal's crossing of the Alps. Yet Roman victory came with surprising ease due to superior logistics, intelligence, and the loyalty of Greek allies who preferred Roman protection to Syrian domination. The Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE showcased Roman tactical evolution, as legions equipped with new weapons and formations systematically destroyed Antiochus's multinational army. The peace settlement expelled Syrian power from Asia Minor entirely, establishing Roman influence throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and demonstrating that no Hellenistic kingdom could successfully resist Roman military might. The Third Punic War, fought between 149 and 146 BCE, revealed the darker aspects of Roman power as Rome deliberately destroyed Carthage despite minimal provocation. Cato's relentless advocacy for Carthaginian destruction finally persuaded the Senate that Rome's former rival must be eliminated entirely to ensure permanent security. The siege of Carthage lasted 3 years and ended with the city's complete destruction, its population killed or enslaved, and its territory converted into the Roman province of Africa. The simultaneous destruction of Corinth in the same year sent an unmistakable message throughout the Mediterranean world that resistance to Roman authority would be met with total annihilation. These acts of calculated brutality demonstrated that Roman power, once primarily defensive and reactive, had become aggressively expansionist and willing to employ extreme measures to maintain dominance. The wealth gained from these conquests funded massive construction projects in Rome itself, including new temples, theatres, and public buildings that proclaimed Roman supremacy to all who visited the city. By 146 BCE, Rome controlled territory from Spain to Asia Minor and from the Sahara Desert to the Danube River. No rival power remained capable of challenging Roman dominance, while Roman fleets patrolled Mediterranean waters that had become effectively a Roman lake. The transformation from small Italian city-state to world empire had occurred within less than 2 centuries. a pace of expansion unprecedented in ancient history, and never matched by any subsequent European power. Yet this unprecedented success contained the seeds of the Republic's eventual destruction. The vast territories under Roman control required new administrative systems that strained Republican institutions designed for governing a single city-state. Provincial commands offered opportunities for enrichment and glory that tempted ambitious Romans to pursue personal advancement over public service, while the constant warfare necessary to maintain imperial dominance created military commanders with personal loyalties to their soldiers rather than to the state itself. The wealth flowing into Rome from conquered territories created economic disparities that threatened social stability, while the cultural sophistication of conquered peoples challenged traditional Roman assumptions about their own superiority. Greek intellectuals questioned Roman political institutions, while Egyptian administrative techniques offered alternatives to Roman governmental practices that some viewed as more efficient than republican procedures developed for much smaller communities. Most ominously, the military success that had created the empire required increasingly professional armies, commanded by generals whose careers depended more on personal achievement than on service to republican ideals. The citizen soldiers who had conquered Italy and defeated Hannibal were being replaced by professional legionaries whose primary loyalty was to commanders who could provide steady pay, regular food, and opportunities for plunder, rather than to abstract concepts of duty to the Roman state. The stage was set for the internal conflicts that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic and transform it into the autocratic empire that would dominate the Western world for another 1,000 years. The very success that had made Rome master of the Mediterranean had created conditions that republican institutions could not manage, while the wealth and power that victory provided would prove irresistible temptations for ambitious individuals willing to destroy the system that had created their opportunities for greatness. The transformation of Roman society during the 2nd century BCE created unprecedented opportunities for individual Romans to accumulate wealth and power that dwarfed anything their ancestors could have imagined. Provincial governorships became prizes that could establish family fortunes for generations, while military commands in conquered territories offered access to tribute, slaves, and precious goods that flowed back to Rome in seemingly endless streams. The traditional Roman emphasis on collective decision-making and shared responsibility began to fracture under the weight of these new realities. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, emerged in the late 2nd century BCE as the first major figures to recognize that Rome's external success was creating internal contradictions that threatened the Republic's survival. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, proposed radical land reforms designed to redistribute public land from wealthy estates back to landless citizens who could serve in Rome's armies. His motivation was both social and military, recognizing that the disappearance of small farmers was undermining the citizen-soldier system that had made Roman expansion possible. The resistance that Tiberius encountered revealed how deeply Roman politics had been transformed by imperial wealth. The Senate, dominated by families whose fortunes depended on large slave-worked estates, viewed his proposals as direct attacks on their economic interests. When Tiberius bypassed the Senate and took his legislation directly to the popular assembly, he violated centuries of political tradition that emphasized consultation and consensus among Rome's elite. The constitutional crisis that followed culminated in Tiberius's assassination by a senatorial mob, marking the first time in Republican history that political disputes had been resolved through violence rather than negotiation. Gaius Gracchus, elected tribune 10 years later, pursued even more radical reforms that included subsidized grain distributions for Rome's urban population, expanded citizenship rights for Italian allies, and judicial changes that transferred control of extortion courts from senators to wealthy non-senatorial Romans called equites. These proposals created new political coalitions that cut across traditional class lines, while demonstrating how imperial revenues could fund domestic programs that would have been impossible in earlier periods of Roman history. The fate that befell Gaius Gracchus was even more dramatic than his brother's assassination. When his reforms faced senatorial opposition, armed confrontations broke out in the streets of Rome itself. The consul Opimius received the Senate's first-ever declaration of martial law, authorizing him to use any means necessary to preserve public order. The battle that followed on the Aventine Hill resulted in Gaius's death, along with 3,000 of his supporters, establishing precedents for political violence that would plague the Republic for the next century. The Gracchian crisis revealed fundamental tensions within Roman society that imperial success had created, but that republican institutions seemed incapable of resolving. The wealth from conquered territories had created opportunities for both individual enrichment and public programs that could benefit ordinary citizens, but the political system that had evolved during Rome's expansion provided no mechanisms for managing these new resources fairly or effectively. Traditional Roman values of frugality and self-sacrifice appeared increasingly irrelevant in a world where provincial commands could make their holders fabulously wealthy within a few years. The military reforms implemented by Gaius Marius in the late 2nd century BCE addressed some of the practical problems that the Gracchian crisis had revealed, while creating new political dangers that would ultimately prove even more destructive. Marius recognized that Rome's expanding commitments required more professional armies than the traditional citizen militia could provide. His decision to recruit volunteers from Rome's landless population, equip them with standardized weapons provided by the state, and train them in permanent units that could serve for extended periods created the professional legions that would dominate ancient warfare for the next 5 centuries. Yet Marius's military innovations also transformed the relationship between Roman soldiers and their commanders in ways that fundamentally altered republican politics. Professional legionaries served for 25 years or more, developing personal loyalty to generals who provided their pay, equipment, and opportunities for advancement. When these soldiers retired, they expected their commanders to secure land grants or monetary rewards that would support them in their old age. This created powerful incentives for successful generals to pursue political careers that could deliver benefits to their veterans, while also giving them access to disciplined forces whose primary allegiance was personal rather than institutional. The social war that erupted in 91 BCE demonstrated how Rome's success had created expectations among its Italian allies that republican institutions struggled to fulfill. The Italian communities that had provided manpower for Roman conquests demanded citizenship rights that would give them political representation proportional to their military contributions. When the Senate resisted these demands, a coalition of Italian peoples launched a coordinated rebellion that required 3 years of bitter fighting to suppress. The resolution of the social war through the extension of citizenship to all Italians south of the Po River created a new Roman identity that encompassed the entire peninsula, while also diluting the traditional connections between citizenship and participation in Roman political life. The hundreds of thousands of new citizens could not practically participate in assemblies that met in Rome itself, creating opportunities for ambitious politicians to claim popular mandates from voters who had little direct knowledge of the issues they were deciding. Lucius Cornelius Sulla's rise to power during the 80s BCE marked the Republic's first experience with sustained autocratic rule by a Roman general who used military force to impose his political agenda on resistant institutions. Sulla's march on Rome in 88 BCE broke the final taboo against using Roman armies against the Roman state itself, while his subsequent proscription list that condemned thousands of Romans to death and confiscation demonstrated how imperial wealth could finance systematic political terror. The constitutional reforms that Sulla implemented during his dictatorship attempted to restore traditional senatorial authority while preventing the kind of popular legislation that had characterized the Gracchian period. He increased the number of magistrates to handle Rome's expanded administrative needs, required former magistrates to serve in provincial commands, that would keep ambitious individuals away from Rome during their most influential years, and restricted the powers of tribunes who had traditionally championed popular causes against elite resistance. Yet Sulla's retirement from power in 79 BCE revealed the fundamental weakness of his constitutional settlement. The very success of his methods demonstrated that republican institutions could not resist determined individuals who commanded loyal armies and possessed sufficient resources to reward their supporters. Within a decade of Sulla's death, ambitious Romans were already dismantling his reforms and pursuing the same strategies of popular appeal and military command that he had attempted to prevent. The rise of Pompey the Great exemplified how imperial expansion had created opportunities for individual Romans to achieve power and influence that transcended traditional republican limitations. Pompey's extraordinary commands against Mediterranean pirates and Eastern kings gave him authority over vast territories and enormous resources while keeping him away from Rome long enough to build a reputation that overshadowed all potential rivals. His triumph in 61 BCE lasted 2 days and displayed treasures from across the known world, demonstrating to ordinary Romans the vast wealth that successful military leadership could generate. The first triumvirate, formed by Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus in 60 BCE, represented an informal agreement among Rome's most powerful individuals to coordinate their political activities in pursuit of mutual advantage rather than competing within traditional republican frameworks. This secret alliance enabled Caesar to obtain the consulship and secure the Gallic command that would make his fortune and reputation, while providing Pompey with the eastern settlement he desired and giving Crassus opportunities to pursue military glory in campaigns against Parthia. Caesar's conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BCE demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Roman military methods against less organized opponents and the personal rewards that successful generalship could provide in Rome's imperial system. The wealth that Caesar extracted from Gallic territories financed massive construction projects in Rome itself, including the new forum that bore his name and contained some of the most spectacular architecture the ancient world had ever seen. The loyalty of his veteran legions gave him a personal military force that could challenge any rival, while his literary accounts of the Gallic campaigns created a public reputation for strategic brilliance and personal courage that enhanced his political position. The growing rivalry between Caesar and Pompey during the 50s BCE reflected structural problems within the republican system that no constitutional arrangement seemed capable of resolving. Both men commanded resources and loyalties that exceeded anything traditional Roman politics could accommodate, while their supporters demanded rewards and recognition that required continued expansion of Roman territory and influence. The Senate's attempts to balance these competing interests satisfied neither faction, while demonstrating its own inability to control the forces that imperial success had unleashed. The civil war that began when Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE marked the effective end of the Roman Republic as a functioning political system. Caesar's famous declaration that the die is cast acknowledged that he was gambling everything on his ability to defeat Pompey and his senatorial supporters through military force rather than political compromise. The speed with which Caesar's veterans conquered Italy demonstrated how completely traditional republican institutions had lost the loyalty of Rome's most effective military forces. Pompey's flight to the eastern Mediterranean revealed his own dependence on resources and alliances that existed outside republican control, while his eventual defeat at Pharsalus in 48 BCE eliminated the last serious military challenge to Caesar's supremacy. The assassination of Pompey on an Egyptian beach by advisors seeking to curry favor with Caesar illustrated how completely Roman politics had been transformed from a system of competing institutions into a contest among individuals whose power rested on personal relationships rather than constitutional authority. Caesar's brief period of dominance demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of autocratic rule within Roman political culture. His massive building projects comprehensive legal reforms, and expansion of citizenship to Gallic communities showed how imperial resources could fund innovations that benefited ordinary Romans while enhancing the ruler's reputation for generosity and vision. Yet his assumption of unprecedented honors, including the title of dictator for life, violated Roman sensibilities about appropriate limits on individual power and created the coalition of senators who assassinated him on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. The conspirators who killed Caesar believed they were restoring republican government, but their actions instead triggered another round of civil wars that would continue for 13 more years until the Republic's final collapse. The second triumvirate, formed by Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, represented an official division of Roman territories among military commanders who made no pretense of respecting traditional institutions or constitutional limitations. Their prescription lists that condemned over 2,000 Romans to death surpassed even Sulla's brutalities, while demonstrating how completely imperial wealth and military force had replaced law and custom as the foundations of Roman political power. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, where Antony and Octavian defeated the last republican armies led by Brutus and Cassius, marked the definitive end of the political system that had governed Rome for nearly 5 centuries. The suicides of the republican leaders, rather than accept defeat, symbolized the impossibility of returning to traditional governmental arrangements that imperial expansion had made obsolete. The stage was now set for the final confrontation between the surviving triumvirs that would determine whether Rome would be ruled by a single autocrat or divided among competing military commanders. The final confrontation between Octavian and Mark Antony would determine not merely who would rule Rome, but what form that rule would take and how it would shape the destiny of the Western world for centuries to come. The division of territories that had emerged from their alliance created 2 distinct power centers, each developing its own character and approach to governance. Octavian controlled the western provinces, including Italy itself, where he carefully cultivated his image as the defender of traditional Roman values and the legitimate heir to Caesar's legacy. Antony commanded the wealthy eastern territories, where he embraced Hellenistic traditions of divine kingship and formed his fateful alliance with Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. This geographic division reflected deeper cultural tensions within the Roman world between Latin and Greek traditions, between republican nostalgia and imperial ambition, between the austere values of early Rome and the sophisticated luxuries that conquest had made available. Octavian positioned himself as the champion of authentic Roman identity, while his propaganda portrayed Antony as corrupted by foreign influences and seduced by Oriental decadence. The reality was far more complex, as both men were products of the same imperial system and employed similar methods to maintain their power and reward their supporters. The economic resources available to each faction revealed how completely the Mediterranean had become integrated under Roman rule. Octavian's control of Italy and the western provinces gave him access to the agricultural wealth of Sicily, the silver mines of Spain, and the manpower of Gaul, while also allowing him to present himself as the protector of Rome itself against foreign threats. Antony's eastern territories provided even greater immediate wealth through the ancient trade routes that connected India and China with the Mediterranean world. But this very prosperity made him appear dependent on non-Roman sources of power and legitimacy. The naval preparations that both sides undertook for their inevitable confrontation demonstrated the strategic importance of controlling Mediterranean shipping lanes and the enormous resources that imperial expansion had placed at the disposal of Roman commanders. Octavian's Admiral Agrippa proved particularly innovative in developing new ship designs and tactical formations that could exploit Roman advantages in engineering and organization, while Antony relied more heavily on the traditional naval expertise of his eastern allies and the massive resources that Egypt could provide for building and maintaining large fleets. The propaganda war that preceded their military confrontation revealed how Roman political culture had adapted to imperial conditions while maintaining the forms and language of republican tradition. Octavian's supporters emphasized his youth, his connection to Caesar's legacy, and his commitment to restoring peace and stability to a war-weary population. They portrayed him as the representative of Roman destiny, chosen by the gods to fulfill Rome's mission of bringing order and civilization to the world. Antony's faction countered by emphasizing his military experience, his loyalty to Caesar's veteran soldiers, and his success in managing the complex political relationships of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE proved decisive not because of its scale or tactical innovation, but because it demonstrated the superiority of Octavian's strategic position and the loyalty of his supporters. When Antony and Cleopatra fled the battlefield, they abandoned not only their fleets, but also their credibility as leaders, capable of protecting their followers' interests. The rapid collapse of their remaining forces showed how completely Roman politics had become dependent on perceptions of strength and success rather than institutional legitimacy or constitutional authority. Antony's suicide in Alexandria the following year eliminated the last serious challenger to Octavian's supremacy, while Cleopatra's death ended the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt since Alexander's conquest 3 centuries earlier. The annexation of Egypt provided Octavian with resources that dwarfed those available to any previous Roman leader, including control over the grain supply that fed Rome's population and the luxury goods that satisfied elite appetites for exotic consumption. The constitutional settlement that Octavian negotiated upon his return to Rome in 29 BCE demonstrated remarkable political sophistication in balancing the need for effective autocratic government with Roman sensitivities about traditional institutions and values. Rather than openly abolishing the Republic or declaring himself king, he carefully constructed a new system that preserved republican forms while concentrating real power in his own hands through a combination of traditional magistracies and innovative authorities that gave him control over military forces, provincial administration, and public resources. The name Augustus, granted to him by the Senate in 27 BCE, captured the religious and cultural dimensions of his new position without explicitly claiming divine status or absolute authority. The title suggested reverence and respect rather than domination, while connecting his rule to the favorable omens and divine approval that Romans believed were necessary for legitimate government. This careful attention to symbolic and ceremonial aspects of power would become characteristic of imperial administration throughout its subsequent history. The Praetorian Guard that Augustus established to protect his person represented a crucial innovation that balanced the need for personal security with republican traditions that prohibited armed forces within the city of Rome itself. These elite soldiers, recruited from Roman citizens and commanded by prefects who answered directly to the emperor, provided a loyal military force that could maintain order in the capital while also serving as a visible symbol of imperial authority and a potential source of political influence in succession crises. The administrative system that emerged under Augustus combined traditional Roman governmental structures with new bureaucratic innovations designed to manage territories and populations that far exceeded the scale of anything the Republic had attempted to govern. The creation of a professional civil service staffed by freedmen and slaves who possessed specialized skills in accounting, law, and administration provided continuity and expertise that supplemented the amateur magistrates who continued to hold traditional offices for limited terms. The cultural patronage that Augustus and his advisors provided created what historians would later recognize as the golden age of Latin literature, as writers like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid produced works that celebrated Roman achievement while exploring the moral and philosophical implications of imperial power. The Aeneid, Virgil's epic poem tracing Rome's mythical origins to the Trojan hero Aeneas, provided a literary foundation for Roman imperial ideology that connected contemporary achievements to divine destiny and ancestral virtue. The building program that Augustus initiated transformed Rome itself into a capital worthy of a world empire, with new temples, theatres, forums, and public amenities that demonstrated imperial wealth while providing employment for Rome's urban population. His famous boast that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble reflected not only architectural achievements, but also the transformation of Roman identity from that of a conquering city-state to that of an imperial capital whose monuments proclaimed its authority to visitors from across the known world. The provincial system that Augustus refined created standardized administrative procedures that could accommodate the diverse populations and local conditions found throughout Roman territories, while maintaining central control over military forces, taxation, and major policy decisions. The distinction between senatorial and imperial provinces reflected both practical considerations about where direct imperial oversight was most necessary and political considerations about preserving senatorial dignity and involvement in governmental administration. The military reforms that Augustus implemented addressed the fundamental problems that had destabilized the late Republic by creating professional armies whose primary loyalty was to the state rather than to individual commanders. The establishment of fixed terms of service, regular pay scales, standardized equipment, and guaranteed retirement benefits eliminated many of the incentives that had previously encouraged soldiers to follow ambitious generals in civil wars, while the concentration of military command in imperial hands prevented potential rivals from building independent power bases. The succession arrangements that Augustus developed during his long reign revealed both his political genius and the fundamental contradictions inherent in creating a stable, autocratic system within a culture that retained strong republican traditions. His adoption of Tiberius and careful preparation of the imperial household for transition demonstrated his understanding that personal rule required institutional continuity, while his reluctance to openly designate a successor reflected the political dangers of appearing to establish a hereditary monarchy. The Pax Romana that emerged from Augustus's constitutional settlement provided the foundation for 2 centuries of unprecedented peace and prosperity throughout the Mediterranean world. The elimination of internal warfare, the standardization of laws and administrative procedures, and the protection of trade routes enabled economic growth and cultural exchange on a scale that would not be matched again until the modern era. Cities flourished throughout the empire as local elites competed to demonstrate their loyalty and prosperity through magnificent public buildings, while rural areas benefited from improved infrastructure and agricultural techniques. Yet this imperial peace came at the cost of the political freedoms and civic engagement that had characterized the Roman Republic at its best. The concentration of real authority in imperial hands reduced the Senate to an advisory body, while the popular assemblies that had once decided questions of war and peace gradually atrophied from disuse. The citizen soldiers who had conquered the Mediterranean world were replaced by professional armies, whose members viewed military service as a career rather than a civic duty. The cultural transformation that accompanied political change was equally profound, as Roman society adapted to conditions of imperial rule that differed fundamentally from the republican traditions that had shaped Roman identity for 5 centuries. The literature, art, and philosophy of the Augustan age reflected these new realities while attempting to preserve connections to earlier values and achievements that gave meaning and legitimacy to contemporary arrangements. The religious innovations that Augustus promoted, including the establishment of his own cult and the revival of traditional festivals and ceremonies, demonstrated his understanding that effective rule required spiritual as well as political authority. The deification of Julius Caesar provided precedent for treating deceased emperors as gods, while the cult of Roma and Augustus, established throughout the provinces, created focal points for imperial loyalty that transcended local traditions and ethnic identities. The economic policies that supported the Augustan settlement revealed how imperial resources could fund both military security and domestic prosperity when managed by competent administrators who understood the relationship between taxation, trade, and public investment. The development of standardized currencies, weights, and measures facilitated commerce throughout the empire, while major infrastructure projects like roads, aqueducts, and harbors provided employment and improved living conditions for millions of imperial subjects. The legal developments that occurred during Augustus's reign laid foundations for the comprehensive law codes that would become one of Rome's most enduring contributions to world civilization. The systematic compilation of legal precedents, the clarification of procedural requirements, and the extension of legal protections to previously excluded populations demonstrated how imperial authority could serve justice as well as order when guided by competent jurists and administrators. As Augustus approached the end of his remarkable 45-year reign, he could survey an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia and from the Rhine to the Sahara Desert. The political system he had created had provided stability and prosperity on an unprecedented scale, while Roman culture and law had begun the process of unifying diverse populations under common institutions and values. The foundation had been laid for an imperial system that would endure for another 4 centuries in the West and more than 1,000 years in the East, shaping the development of European civilization and leaving an indelible mark on human history. The death of Augustus in 14 CE marked the end of the beginning of Roman imperial history and the start of a new phase in which the institutions and traditions he had established would be tested by the ambitions, capabilities, and failures of his successors. The Principate, as historians would later term his system of government, had successfully resolved the crisis of the late Republic, while creating new challenges that would require constant adaptation and innovation to maintain the delicate balance between autocratic efficiency and traditional Roman values. Values. The succession of Tiberius to the imperial throne in 14 CE demonstrated both the strength and the inherent instability of the system Augustus had created. Unlike the founders of other ancient dynasties, Augustus had not simply bequeathed power to his biological heir, but had instead adopted Tiberius as his son and carefully prepared him for rule through a series of military commands and administrative responsibilities that established his credentials as a capable leader. Yet this very process of preparation revealed the fundamental tension between the need for competent leadership and the absence of clear constitutional mechanisms for transferring power in a system that officially maintained republican forms. Tiberius brought to the imperial office a combination of military experience and administrative skill that few Romans could match, having served with distinction on the Germanic and Pannonian frontiers, while also demonstrating his ability to manage the complex political relationships that imperial rule required. His campaigns beyond the Rhine had secured Roman control over territories that Augustus himself had been unable to pacify, while his diplomatic negotiations with Parthian rulers had resolved eastern boundary disputes without resorting to costly military interventions that might have destabilized imperial finances. Yet Tiberius also embodied the contradictions that imperial rule created within traditional Roman culture. His reluctance to accept the imperial position, famously documented in Tacitus's account of his apparent hesitation before the Senate, reflected genuine uncertainty about the legitimacy of autocratic power within a political system that still claimed to honor republican traditions. His subsequent withdrawal from Rome to the island of Capri demonstrated how the burdens of imperial responsibility could isolate rulers from the very populations they governed, creating opportunities for misunderstanding and resentment that would plague subsequent emperors throughout the dynasty. The administrative efficiency that characterized Tiberius's reign revealed how the imperial system could function effectively even when the emperor himself remained physically distant from the capital. The bureaucratic structures that Augustus had established provided sufficient institutional continuity to maintain governmental operations, while the loyalty of key administrators like the Praetorian prefect Sejanus ensured that imperial authority could be exercised through trusted subordinates. This delegation of responsibility demonstrated the maturation of imperial institutions, while also creating new vulnerabilities that ambitious individuals could exploit for personal advantage. The economic prosperity that flourished during Tiberius's reign reflected the continued benefits of the Augustan settlement, as peace and stability enabled trade networks to expand throughout the empire, while provincial populations adapted to Roman administrative systems and legal frameworks. The absence of major military campaigns reduced governmental expenditures while allowing tax revenues from prosperous provinces to accumulate in the imperial treasury, creating financial reserves that would prove crucial for supporting the more ambitious projects and policies of subsequent rulers. The cultural developments of the Tiberian period demonstrated how imperial patronage had transformed Roman intellectual life from the competitive environment of the Republic into a more controlled system where literary and artistic achievement depended increasingly on imperial favor and official approval. The historian Tacitus would later criticize this transformation as producing a decline in oratorical skill and political engagement. Yet the period also witnessed remarkable achievements in engineering, architecture, and jurisprudence that expanded human knowledge and capability in ways that the more chaotic conditions of the late Republic had rarely permitted. The conspiracy of Sejanus that dominated the later years of Tiberius's reign illustrated how the concentration of power in imperial hands created opportunities for ambitious subordinates to pursue their own political agendas while claiming to serve imperial interests. Sejanus's systematic elimination of potential rivals within the imperial family and his efforts to position himself as Tiberius's successor demonstrated that the informal nature of imperial succession arrangements could create dangerous uncertainties that threatened the stability of the entire system. The dramatic fall of Sejanus in 31 CE, when Tiberius finally recognized the extent of his prefect's ambitions and ordered his execution, revealed both the emperor's continued control over key governmental functions and the paranoia that imperial isolation could generate. The subsequent purges that eliminated Sejanus's supporters created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that would characterize the remainder of Tiberius's reign, while establishing precedents for the use of treason trials as political weapons that later emperors would employ with devastating effect. The accession of Caligula in 37 CE marked a dramatic shift in imperial style and priorities that reflected both his youth and his lack of preparation for the responsibilities that Augustus and Tiberius had handled with such care. The enthusiasm with which Romans initially greeted his reign demonstrated their relief at escaping the oppressive atmosphere of Tiberius's final years, while his generous distribution of bonuses to praetorian guards and urban populations showed how imperial resources could purchase popular support when deployed by rulers who understood the political importance of public spectacle and largesse. The rapid deterioration of Caligula's reign into tyrannical excess revealed the dangers inherent in a system that provided virtually unlimited power to individuals whose character and capabilities remained unknown until they assumed office. His demands for divine honors, his sadistic treatment of senators and other elites, and his grandiose building projects that rapidly depleted the treasury accumulated by Tiberius demonstrated how quickly imperial authority could be perverted into instruments of personal gratification rather than effective governance. The assassination of Caligula by praetorian officers in 41 CE marked the first violent transfer of imperial power and established precedents that would haunt the empire throughout its subsequent history. The conspirators' inability to restore republican government revealed how completely imperial institutions had displaced traditional political structures, while their decision to elevate Claudius to the throne demonstrated that effective power now resided with military forces rather than constitutional authorities. Claudius's unexpected elevation to imperial office proved that competent leadership could emerge from the most unlikely sources within the imperial system, as his scholarly background and apparent physical disabilities had excluded him from serious political consideration during the reigns of his predecessors. His comprehensive administrative reforms, his successful conquest of Britain, and his extension of citizenship rights to provincial populations demonstrated how imperial authority could serve constructive purposes when exercised by rulers who understood both the possibilities and the limitations of autocratic power. The Claudian invasion of Britain in 43 CE represented the first major territorial expansion since Augustus had established the empire's boundaries, while also demonstrating how military success could enhance imperial prestige and provide opportunities for rewarding loyal supporters with commands, honours, and wealth derived from conquest. The systematic nature of the British campaigns, with their careful attention to logistics, engineering, and the establishment of permanent administrative structures, revealed how Roman military methods had evolved during the early imperial period to accommodate the requirements of governing distant territories with diverse populations and unfamiliar geographic conditions. The legal and administrative innovations that Claudius implemented throughout the empire reflected his deep understanding of Roman institutional history and his recognition that effective imperial government required constant adaptation to changing circumstances and new challenges. His expansion of the civil service to include qualified freedmen and his standardization of judicial procedures created bureaucratic systems that could function efficiently across vast distances while maintaining consistency with Roman legal traditions and constitutional principles. The influence of Claudius's wives, particularly Messalina and Agrippina, on imperial policy revealed how the informal aspects of imperial power could create opportunities for individuals without official authority to shape governmental decisions through personal relationships with rulers who remained isolated from traditional political networks. The scandals surrounding Messalina's behaviour and her eventual execution demonstrated the political dangers that could arise when imperial family members pursued their own agendas without regard for broader governmental interests or public opinion. The adoption of Nero as Claudius's heir, orchestrated by Agrippina to advance her own son's prospects for succession, illustrated how imperial family politics had become intertwined with broader questions of governmental succession and policy direction. The careful preparation that Agrippina arranged for Nero's education, including instruction by the philosopher Seneca and training in public speaking and administrative procedures, reflected her understanding that successful imperial rule required both intellectual sophistication and practical political skills. The death of Claudius in 54 CE, possibly through poisoning administered by Agrippina to ensure her son's smooth succession, marked another crucial transition in imperial history that tested the stability of the institutions Augustus had created. Nero's accession at the age of 16 made him the youngest emperor in Roman history, while also placing him under the influence of advisors whose competing agendas would shape the early years of his reign and ultimately contribute to its catastrophic conclusion. The initial promise of Nero's reign, guided by Seneca's philosophical wisdom and Burrus's military experience, demonstrated how effective imperial government could function when competent advisors provided guidance to young rulers while maintaining respect for established administrative procedures and traditional Roman values. The cultural patronage that characterized this period, including support for Greek artistic traditions and innovative architectural projects, revealed how imperial resources could foster intellectual and creative achievement, while also serving the political purposes of enhancing imperial prestige and popular support. The gradual deterioration of Nero's character and judgment, perhaps accelerated by the corrupting effects of unlimited power and the removal of restraining influences through the deaths of Burrus and the exile of Seneca, illustrated the fundamental vulnerability of autocratic systems to the personal failings of individual rulers. His increasing focus on artistic performance, his neglect of administrative responsibilities, and his brutal treatment of family members and political rivals created conditions that would ultimately provoke the military rebellions that ended both his reign and the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE provided Nero with both an opportunity to demonstrate effective crisis management and a platform for the grandiose rebuilding projects that reflected his architectural ambitions and his desire to transform the imperial capital into a showcase worthy of his artistic vision. The construction of the Golden House, with its revolutionary architectural innovations and unprecedented scale, demonstrated how imperial resources could fund projects that advanced human knowledge and capability while also serving the personal glorification of autocratic rulers. The persecution of Christians that followed the Great Fire revealed how imperial authority could be directed against minority populations when political necessity or personal prejudice provided motivation for systematic oppression. The spectacles in which Christians were burned alive to illuminate Nero's gardens demonstrated the depths of cruelty that unlimited power could enable, while also creating martyrs whose stories would inspire resistance to imperial authority and contribute to the eventual transformation of the empire itself. The Pisonian conspiracy of 65 CE, which sought to assassinate Nero and replace him with a more acceptable ruler, illustrated how the concentration of power in imperial hands created incentives for desperate individuals to resort to violence when legal and constitutional means of political change had been eliminated. The conspiracy's failure and the subsequent executions of prominent Romans, including Seneca, demonstrated how imperial paranoia could destroy the very elites whose cooperation and expertise effective government required. The Jewish revolt that began in 66 CE tested imperial military capabilities, while also revealing the religious and cultural tensions that Roman rule had created in regions where local traditions conflicted with imperial requirements for political loyalty and cultural assimilation. The systematic nature of the Roman response, culminating in the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple in 70 CE, demonstrated both the military effectiveness of imperial forces and the ruthless determination with which Roman authorities would suppress challenges to their authority. The year of 4 emperors that followed Nero's suicide in 68 CE marked the most serious crisis of imperial legitimacy since Augustus had established the Principate, as competing military commanders fought for control of the empire while demonstrating that effective power resided with armies rather than constitutional institutions or hereditary succession. The rapid succession of Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian revealed both the fragility of imperial authority when it lacked military support and the resilience of imperial institutions that continued to function despite political chaos at the highest levels of government. The emergence of Vespasian from the chaos of civil war demonstrated how military competence and practical wisdom could restore stability to imperial institutions that had been nearly destroyed by the excesses and failures of previous rulers. Unlike the aristocratic Julio-Claudians, who had inherited their positions through family connections, Vespasian represented a new type of emperor whose authority rested on demonstrated ability rather than hereditary claims. His rise from relatively modest origins in the Sabine Hills to command of the Eastern legions illustrated how imperial expansion had created opportunities for capable individuals from throughout Italy to achieve positions of unprecedented power and responsibility. The siege of Jerusalem that Vespasian had been conducting, when news of Nero's death reached him, provided him with both the military resources and the strategic position necessary to challenge other claimants to imperial power. His decision to leave the completion of this campaign to his son Titus, while he secured control over Egypt and its crucial grain supplies, revealed the sophisticated political calculation that would characterize his entire reign. By controlling the food supply that sustained Rome's massive urban population, Vespasian could exert pressure on potential rivals while demonstrating his understanding of the economic foundations that supported imperial authority. The Flavian dynasty that Vespasian established would prove remarkably successful at balancing the competing demands of military effectiveness, administrative efficiency, and popular satisfaction that imperial rule required. His construction of the Colosseum provided spectacular entertainment for Rome's masses, while also creating employment for thousands of workers and artisans whose skills enhanced the capital's architectural splendor. This massive amphitheater, capable of holding 50,000 spectators, represented both the engineering capabilities that Roman civilization had achieved and the resources that successful imperial government could mobilize for public projects. The administrative reforms that Vespasian implemented throughout the empire reflected his practical approach to governance and his recognition that effective rule required systematic attention to taxation, military organization, and provincial administration. His famous declaration that money has no odor, made in response to criticism of a tax on public latrines, revealed his pragmatic understanding that imperial revenues must come from whatever sources were available, rather than from ideologically pure but financially inadequate alternatives. The expansion of citizenship rights that Vespasian promoted, particularly through the elevation of Spanish and Gallic communities to full Roman status, demonstrated how imperial policy could serve both practical and idealistic purposes. These newly enfranchised populations provided additional sources of military recruitment and tax revenue, while also fulfilling the universalist potential inherent in Roman legal and political concepts. The integration of provincial elites into the Roman Senate and administrative hierarchy created new loyalties that strengthened imperial cohesion, while diluting the traditional dominance of Italian families. The succession of Titus in 79 CE, following Vespasian's death from natural causes after a decade of successful rule, marked the first peaceful transfer of power from father to son since Augustus had adopted Tiberius. Titus's brief but memorable reign was marked by his generous response to natural disasters, including the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum, and his completion of the Colosseum with spectacular inaugural games that lasted 100 days and featured exotic animals from across the empire. The catastrophic eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE provided later historians with an unprecedented glimpse into daily life in Roman provincial cities, as the volcanic ash that killed thousands of inhabitants also preserved their homes, shops, and personal possessions with remarkable fidelity. The discovery of these buried cities centuries later would reveal the prosperity and sophistication that Roman civilization had achieved in even relatively modest urban centers, while the graffiti and personal artifacts found in the ruins demonstrated how completely Roman cultural patterns had penetrated into the daily lives of ordinary people throughout the empire. The accession of Domitian following his brother's unexpected death in 81 CE brought to power a ruler whose authoritarian tendencies and paranoid suspicions would ultimately destroy the stability that Vespasian and Titus had carefully constructed. Domitian's military campaigns along the Rhine and Danube frontiers achieved significant tactical successes, while also demonstrating the continued pressure that barbarian tribes exerted on imperial boundaries. But his domestic policies created tensions with senatorial elites that would ultimately provoke the conspiracy that ended his life and his dynasty. The architectural projects that Domitian sponsored, including extensive renovations to the imperial palaces and the construction of new temples and public buildings throughout Rome, revealed both his desire for personal glorification and his understanding of how monumental construction could enhance imperial prestige while providing employment for urban populations. His palace on the Palatine Hill, with its elaborate audience chambers and private apartments, established architectural precedents that would influence imperial residences throughout the subsequent history of the empire. The persecution of philosophers and intellectuals that characterized Domitian's later years reflected the emperor's growing paranoia about potential sources of opposition, while also revealing the cultural tensions between Greek intellectual traditions and Roman political authority that had persisted since the conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean. The exile of prominent thinkers and the restriction of philosophical schools demonstrated how imperial power could stifle intellectual freedom when rulers perceived ideas as threats to their authority. The assassination of Domitian in 96 CE by palace conspirators who had grown fearful of the emperor's increasingly erratic behavior marked the end of the Flavian dynasty and created another succession crisis that tested the resilience of imperial institutions. The rapid elevation of Nerva by the Senate demonstrated that traditional Roman governmental bodies retained sufficient authority to influence imperial succession when military forces remained neutral, while also revealing the continuing importance of elite consensus in legitimizing autocratic rule. The adoption of Trajan by Nerva represented a crucial innovation in imperial succession that would provide stability for the next century by establishing the principle that emperors should choose their successors based on merit rather than family relationships. This adoptive system enabled the selection of capable rulers from throughout the empire while maintaining continuity in governmental policies and administrative procedures. Trajan's Spanish origins symbolize the cosmopolitan character that the empire had achieved, while his military reputation ensured the loyalty of frontier armies whose support remained essential for imperial stability. The reign of Trajan, from 98 to 117 CE, marked the height of Roman territorial expansion and military glory, as his campaigns in Dacia, Armenia, and Mesopotamia extended imperial boundaries to their greatest extent, while bringing unprecedented wealth flowing into imperial treasuries. The systematic exploitation of Dacian gold mines provided resources that funded massive public works projects, including Trajan's Forum and Column, that commemorated his victories while creating some of the most spectacular architecture the ancient world had ever seen. The engineering achievements of Trajan's reign, including the construction of roads, bridges, and harbours that facilitated communication and commerce throughout the expanded empire, demonstrated how imperial resources could serve practical purposes that benefited all imperial subjects, rather than merely enhancing the ruler's personal prestige. The bridge that Trajan's engineer Apollodorus constructed across the Danube River represented the pinnacle of Roman engineering capability, while the harbour facilities built at Ostia ensured reliable grain supplies for Rome's growing population. The legal and administrative innovations that Trajan promoted, particularly through his correspondence with Pliny the Younger regarding provincial government, revealed the systematic attention to detail and commitment to justice that characterized the best imperial administration. These letters, preserved for later generations, provided insights into how imperial authority functioned at the local level, while also demonstrating the personal involvement that effective emperors maintained in even routine governmental decisions. The cultural patronage that flourished during Trajan's reign supported literary and artistic achievements that celebrated Roman accomplishments while also exploring the moral and philosophical questions that imperial success had raised. The historian Tacitus produced his masterworks on Roman history and ethnography during this period, while the poet Juvenal crafted satirical verses that examined the social changes that imperial expansion had created within Roman society itself. The succession of Hadrian in 117 CE brought to power perhaps the most intellectually curious and culturally sophisticated ruler in Roman history, whose travels throughout the empire and personal involvement in architectural and artistic projects demonstrated how imperial authority could serve broader purposes than mere political control or military conquest. His decision to consolidate rather than continue Trajan's territorial expansion reflected both practical recognition of imperial limitations and philosophical understanding that sustainable civilization required internal development rather than constant external growth. The wall that Hadrian constructed across northern Britain became the most famous symbol of imperial frontier policy, representing both the military engineering capabilities that Roman civilization had achieved and the recognition that even Roman power had geographical and demographic limits that prudent rulers would respect. This massive fortification, stretching 73 miles across the narrowest part of the island, demonstrated how imperial resources could create permanent solutions to strategic problems, while also providing employment and economic opportunities for frontier populations. The architectural projects that Hadrian personally designed, including the reconstruction of the Pantheon in Rome and the founding of Antinopolis in Egypt, revealed his sophisticated understanding of how buildings could serve both practical and symbolic purposes while advancing human knowledge of mathematical and engineering principles. The Pantheon's revolutionary concrete dome, still standing today, represented the culmination of Roman architectural achievement, while creating interior spaces that had never before been enclosed by human construction. The codification of Roman law that accelerated during Hadrian's reign, particularly through the work of the jurist Salvius Julianus, created systematic legal frameworks that would influence jurisprudence throughout subsequent European history. The perpetual edict that emerged from this process standardized legal procedures while preserving the flexibility that Roman law required to accommodate diverse local conditions and evolving social circumstances throughout the empire. The Bar Kokhba revolt that erupted in Judea during the final years of Hadrian's reign tested imperial military capabilities, while also revealing the persistent religious and cultural tensions that Roman rule had created in regions where local traditions conflicted irreconcilably with imperial requirements. The brutal suppression of this rebellion, which required the commitment of substantial military resources and resulted in enormous casualties on both sides, demonstrated both the determination with which Roman authorities would defend imperial unity and the costs that such determination could impose on conquered populations. The reign of Antoninus Pius, from 138 to 161 CE, represented the pinnacle of imperial peace and prosperity, as his cautious policies and administrative competence created conditions that allowed Roman civilization to flourish throughout the Mediterranean world, without the disruptions that military campaigns or political upheavals typically generated. His 40-year residence in Rome without visiting the provinces demonstrated how effectively imperial institutions had developed to manage vast territories through systematic administrative procedures, rather than personal imperial supervision. The cultural achievements of the Antonine period, including the philosophical works of Marcus Aurelius and the satirical novels of Apuleius, revealed how imperial stability could foster intellectual development that explored fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and moral responsibility. The emergence of the Second Sophistic movement demonstrated how Greek intellectual traditions had adapted to Roman political conditions, while maintaining their distinctive approaches to rhetoric, philosophy, and literary expression. The succession of Marcus Aurelius in 161 CE brought to the imperial throne a philosopher-emperor whose personal writings would provide later generations with unique insights into how power and responsibility affected individuals who possessed both unlimited authority and deep moral convictions. His meditations, written during military campaigns along the Danube frontier, revealed the internal struggles that thoughtful rulers experienced while managing the competing demands of practical governance and ethical principle. The philosophical reflections that Marcus Aurelius recorded during his military campaigns revealed the profound tensions between contemplative wisdom and the brutal realities of imperial governance. While his Stoic training emphasized virtue, rationality, and acceptance of fate, his responsibilities as emperor required him to make decisions that resulted in death, displacement, and suffering for thousands of people. His private writings documented this struggle between personal conviction and political necessity, creating a remarkable record of how absolute power affected an individual who genuinely sought to govern according to ethical principles. The Marcomannic Wars that dominated the later years of Marcus Aurelius's reign demonstrated how external pressures continued to test Roman military capabilities, even at the height of imperial development. Germanic tribes displaced by population movements further north pressed against the Danube frontier with unprecedented coordination and determination, forcing Rome to commit massive resources to defensive campaigns that offered little prospect of territorial gain or economic benefit. These conflicts revealed the fundamental shift that had occurred in Roman strategic thinking from offensive expansion to defensive consolidation. The plague that swept through the empire during the 160s CE, possibly smallpox or measles introduced through contact with Asian trade routes, created demographic and economic disruptions that challenged every aspect of imperial administration. Cities that had flourished for centuries found their populations decimated, while rural areas struggled to maintain agricultural production with reduced labor forces. The emperor's personal exposure to disease during his frontier campaigns, where he shared the hardships of common soldiers, demonstrated the democratic character of epidemic illness that could affect rulers and subjects equally. The economic pressures created by continuous warfare and demographic decline forced Marcus Aurelius to implement fiscal policies that departed significantly from the conservative financial management that had characterized earlier imperial administration. The debasement of silver currency to fund military expenses created inflationary pressures that affected trade and taxation throughout the empire, while the sale of imperial property to raise revenue demonstrated how even the wealthiest government in ancient history could face serious financial constraints when circumstances demanded sustained military expenditure. The joint rule that Marcus Aurelius established with Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, represented an innovative attempt to divide imperial responsibilities between multiple competent individuals, rather than concentrating all authority in a single ruler. This arrangement allowed Marcus Aurelius to focus on philosophical study and domestic administration, while Varus commanded military campaigns in the east against Parthian forces that threatened Roman control over Armenia and Mesopotamia. The success of this collaboration suggested possibilities for imperial organization that subsequent rulers would unfortunately fail to develop. The Antonine Plague's impact on Roman society extended far beyond immediate mortality to influence religious, cultural, and social developments that would reshape imperial civilization for centuries to come. Traditional Roman religious practices proved inadequate to address the psychological needs created by mass death and social disruption, creating opportunities for mystery cults and philosophical schools that offered more satisfying explanations for human suffering and promises of spiritual salvation. Christianity, still a minority religion, gained converts among populations seeking meaning in catastrophic circumstances. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, while campaigning along the Danube frontier, marked the end of what historians would later term the Antonine Golden Age, and the beginning of a period of increasing instability that would test every institution and tradition that had sustained Roman civilization for nearly 4 centuries. His decision to designate his biological son Commodus as successor, rather than continuing the adoptive principle that had produced a century of capable rulers, reflected both natural parental affection and political calculation about the need to maintain dynastic continuity during dangerous times. The reign of Commodus revealed how quickly imperial institutions could deteriorate when incompetent or uninterested rulers failed to provide the personal attention and political skill that effective governance required. His preference for gladiatorial combat over administrative responsibilities, his grandiose identification with the hero Hercules, and his willingness to delegate crucial governmental functions to freedmen and favorites created conditions that encouraged corruption, rebellion, and ultimately the conspiracy that ended his life and triggered another succession crisis. The architectural extravagances that Commodus sponsored, including modifications to imperial palaces and amphitheatres that reflected his obsession with gladiatorial spectacle, demonstrated how imperial resources could be wasted on projects that served personal gratification rather than public benefit. His construction of private training facilities and his participation in public games shocked traditional Roman sensibilities about appropriate imperial dignity, while also revealing how completely the emperor's personal interests had diverged from the responsibilities of effective leadership. The Praetorian prefect Perennis, and later the freedman Cleander, who successively controlled governmental administration during Commodus's reign, illustrated how the concentration of imperial authority created opportunities for ambitious subordinates to pursue personal enrichment while claiming to serve imperial interests. Their systematic sale of offices, manipulation of tax collection, and involvement in commercial enterprises demonstrated the corruption that could flourish when emperors neglected their oversight responsibilities. The military conspiracies that developed during the later years of Commodus's reign reflected growing dissatisfaction among professional officers who recognized that incompetent leadership threatened both imperial security and their own career prospects. The emperor's erratic behavior, including his demands for divine honors and his unpredictable treatment of military commanders, created uncertainties that made long-term planning impossible while undermining the discipline and morale that effective armies required. The assassination of Commodus on New Year's Eve, 192 CE, by conspirators that included his own wrestling partner, demonstrated how completely the emperor had alienated even his most intimate associates through his capricious cruelty and megalomaniacal behavior. The conspirators' inability to establish a stable succession arrangement revealed the absence of institutional mechanisms for managing imperial transitions when hereditary succession failed and no obvious alternative candidate commanded broad support. The year of the 5 emperors that followed Commodus's death created the most serious imperial crisis since the civil wars that had ended the Republic, as competing claimants demonstrated that military force rather than constitutional legitimacy had become the primary determinant of political authority. Pertinax's brief reign revealed both the possibility of competent governance and the practical difficulties that reform-minded emperors faced when attempting to restore fiscal responsibility and administrative efficiency after periods of corruption and mismanagement. The auction of the imperial office conducted by the Praetorian Guard after Pertinax's assassination represented perhaps the most degrading moment in Roman political history, as the position created by Augustus to provide stable leadership for the Mediterranean world was literally sold to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus's purchase of imperial authority demonstrated how completely the Principate's constitutional foundations had eroded when military force became the sole basis for political legitimacy. The emergence of Septimius Severus from the provincial armies of the Danube frontier marked the beginning of a new phase in imperial history characterized by military dominance, increased autocracy, and the systematic exclusion of traditional senatorial elites from positions of real authority. His African origins symbolized the cosmopolitan character that the empire had achieved, while his military background reflected the practical requirements that imperial survival now demanded in an increasingly dangerous strategic environment. The systematic purges that Severus conducted against supporters of his defeated rivals demonstrated both his political ruthlessness and his understanding that imperial authority required the elimination of potential sources of opposition rather than the incorporation of former enemies that had characterized earlier succession arrangements. The confiscation of property belonging to condemned senators provided resources for rewarding military supporters while also removing wealthy individuals who might have funded future rebellions. The legal and administrative reforms that Severus implemented reflected his recognition that imperial government required more systematic approaches to taxation, military recruitment, and provincial administration than the informal arrangements that had sufficed during more stable periods. His extension of citizenship rights to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire through the Constitutio Antoniniana created new sources of tax revenue while also fulfilling the universalist potential inherent in Roman legal and political concepts. The military innovations that characterized the Severan period, including increased pay for soldiers, expanded auxiliary units recruited from barbarian populations, and the development of new siege technologies, demonstrated how imperial defense required constant adaptation to evolving threats and strategic circumstances. The establishment of permanent military camps near major cities created new relationships between civilian and military populations, while also providing security against both external invasion and internal rebellion. The cultural patronage that flourished during the Severan dynasty, including the legal scholarship of Papinian and Ulpian and the historical writings of Cassius Dio, revealed how imperial stability could foster intellectual achievements, even during periods of political uncertainty and military pressure. The development of provincial law schools and administrative training programs demonstrated systematic approaches to preparing competent officials for imperial service throughout the expanded empire. The reign of Caracalla, from 211 to 217 CE, exemplified the increasing militarization of imperial authority, as the emperor spent most of his time campaigning along various frontiers, while delegating domestic administration to subordinates whose primary qualification was personal loyalty rather than administrative competence. His construction of massive bath complexes in Rome provided spectacular public amenities, while also demonstrating how imperial resources could fund projects that enhanced urban life for ordinary citizens. The assassination of Caracalla during a campaign against Parthia revealed the continuing vulnerability of emperors to military conspiracies, while the brief reign of Macrinus demonstrated how provincial commanders could seize imperial authority through careful planning and military support, even when they lacked traditional qualifications for rule. The rapid collapse of Macrinus's government illustrated the importance of managing relationships with powerful interest groups, including the Praetorian Guard, senatorial aristocracy, and urban populations, whose support remained essential for imperial stability. The restoration of the Severan dynasty through Elagabalus represented a successful manipulation of military loyalty and religious sentiment by Syrian courtwomen who understood how imperial succession could be influenced through careful political calculation and strategic use of available resources. The young emperor's exotic religious practices and unconventional personal behavior created scandals that shocked traditional Roman sensibilities, while also revealing how completely imperial authority had become divorced from republican constitutional traditions. The reign of Alexander Severus, the last of the Severan dynasty, demonstrated both the potential for competent imperial administration and the growing external pressures that threatened Roman territorial integrity and internal stability. His mother Julia Mamaea's influence on governmental policy reflected the continuing importance of imperial family networks in shaping administrative decisions, while the emperor's own scholarly interests and administrative reforms suggested possibilities for imperial renewal that circumstances would unfortunately prevent from achieving full development. The Persian resurgence under the Sassanid dynasty created new strategic challenges that required substantial military resources and innovative tactical approaches, while Germanic tribal confederations along the Rhine and Danube frontiers demonstrated increasing organizational sophistication that made traditional Roman defensive strategies less effective. The empire found itself fighting simultaneous campaigns on multiple fronts, with resources stretched beyond their capacity to maintain the territorial integrity that previous generations had taken for granted. The assassination of Alexander Severus in 235 CE by mutinous troops frustrated with his cautious military policies marked the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of unprecedented political instability, economic disruption, and military pressure that would nearly destroy the imperial system that had governed the Mediterranean world for over 2 centuries. The next 50 years would witness the elevation of more than 20 emperors, most of whom would die violent deaths, while external enemies penetrated deep into imperial territory and economic collapse threatened the foundations of urban civilization throughout the Roman world. The crisis that engulfed the Roman world after 235 CE would test every institution, tradition, and assumption that had sustained imperial civilization for over 2 centuries. What historians would later term the crisis of the 3rd century represented far more than a simple succession dispute or temporary military setback. It was a fundamental breakdown of the political, economic, and social systems that had enabled Rome to govern territories stretching from Scotland to the Sahara Desert and from the Atlantic Ocean to the Euphrates River. The military anarchy that characterized this period saw emperors elevated and murdered with bewildering frequency as armies throughout the empire discovered that imperial authority rested ultimately on their willingness to support it. Maximinus Thrax, the first of the soldier emperors, demonstrated how completely the Principate had evolved from Augustus's careful balance between republican tradition and autocratic efficiency into naked military despotism. His Germanic origins and rise through the ranks symbolized the cosmopolitan character that the imperial army had achieved, while his brutal taxation policies and constant campaigning revealed the desperate measures that imperial survival now required. The simultaneous rebellions that erupted throughout the empire during the 240s CE created unprecedented challenges for imperial administration, as multiple claimants to imperial authority controlled different regions, while external enemies exploited Roman weakness to launch devastating invasions. The Gothic raids that penetrated deep into Asia Minor and the Balkans demonstrated how barbarian military capabilities had evolved to exploit Roman tactical weaknesses, while Persian offensives in the east reclaimed territories that Rome had controlled for centuries. The capture of Emperor Valerian by Persian forces in 260 CE represented the ultimate humiliation for a state that had never previously lost a ruler to foreign enemies. The propaganda value that Sassanid rulers extracted from this victory, including the famous rock relief at Nakshi Rustam showing the Roman emperor kneeling before Shapur I, proclaimed to the ancient world that Roman military supremacy was no longer unquestionable. The psychological impact of this defeat reverberated throughout the empire as populations that had never known foreign conquest suddenly faced the possibility that Roman protection might prove inadequate. The economic collapse that accompanied political instability created hardships that affected every level of society, from wealthy senators to urban craftsmen to rural farmers. The debasement of silver currency to fund military expenses created hyperinflation that made long-term commercial planning impossible while destroying the savings of ordinary citizens who had trusted in imperial monetary stability. Trade networks that had connected distant provinces for centuries contracted as merchants found it impossible to conduct business across territories controlled by competing military commanders. The urban decline that characterized much of the 3rd century reflected the breakdown of the economic relationships that had sustained imperial civilization since Augustus had established the Principate. Cities that had flourished for centuries found themselves unable to maintain their public buildings, water systems and defensive walls as tax revenues declined and imperial subsidies disappeared. The abandonment of marginal agricultural settlements created refugee populations that strained the resources of surviving urban centers, while reducing the agricultural productivity that sustained imperial civilization. The religious transformations that accelerated during this period of crisis reflected the inadequacy of traditional Roman cults to provide meaning and hope during unprecedented catastrophic circumstances. Mystery religions promising personal salvation and divine protection attracted converts among populations facing military invasion, economic collapse, and social disruption that seemed to herald the end of civilized life itself. Christianity, which had remained a minority religion despite occasional persecution, gained adherents among those seeking spiritual explanations for worldly suffering. The emergence of breakaway empires in Gaul and the East during the 260s CE demonstrated how completely central imperial authority had collapsed as regional commanders established independent governments that could provide more effective protection and administration than the chaos prevailing in Italy itself. The Gallic Empire, established by Postumus, controlled territories from Britain to the Rhine for over a decade, while Zenobia's Palmyrene kingdom dominated Syria and Egypt with remarkable success until Aurelian's reconquest campaigns. These separatist movements revealed both the resilience of Roman governmental institutions and the extent to which imperial unity had depended on effective central leadership rather than deeply rooted loyalty to abstract political concepts. Provincial populations supported whichever authority could maintain order and security, while local elites adapted to changing political circumstances by transferring their allegiance to the most effective available ruler, regardless of their constitutional legitimacy or connection to traditional Roman authority. The military reforms that emerged from this period of crisis reflected hard-won lessons about the strategic realities that imperial defense now faced. The traditional distinction between legions stationed along frontiers and auxiliary units providing specialized support broke down as military commanders developed more flexible organizational structures that could respond rapidly to threats from multiple directions. The increased recruitment of Germanic and other barbarian soldiers into Roman armies created new tactical capabilities, while also transforming the cultural character of imperial military forces. The fortification programs that accelerated throughout the later 3rd century demonstrated recognition that the empire could no longer rely on offensive operations to maintain security, but must instead develop comprehensive defensive systems capable of protecting vital territories and communication routes. The construction of new walls around major cities reflected the reality that urban populations could no longer depend on distant frontier armies for protection against raiders who had learned to exploit the empire's strategic vulnerabilities. The reign of Aurelian, from 270 to 275 CE, marked the beginning of imperial recovery as this soldier emperor demonstrated that competent military leadership could still restore Roman authority when supported by adequate resources and strategic vision. His reconquest of the breakaway territories, his successful defense of Italy against Alemannic invasions, and his construction of new walls around Rome itself showed that the imperial system retained sufficient vitality to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges when guided by capable leadership. The monetary reforms that Aurelian implemented, including the introduction of new silver coins with standardized weight and purity, began the process of restoring economic stability that would enable imperial recovery during the following century. His reorganization of tax collection systems and his efforts to revive abandoned agricultural settlements demonstrated systematic approaches to addressing the economic disruption that had accompanied decades of political chaos and military emergency. The religious policies that Aurelian promoted, particularly his establishment of an official cult honoring Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, reflected recognition that imperial unity required spiritual as well as political foundations that could transcend local traditions and ethnic divisions. This solar monotheism provided a theological framework that could accommodate diverse religious practices while creating common symbols and ceremonies that reinforced imperial identity throughout the Mediterranean world. The assassination of Aurelian in 275 CE by officers who feared his disciplinary measures demonstrated the continuing fragility of imperial authority even when exercised by capable and successful rulers. The brief interregnum that followed his death revealed both the institutional weakness that had developed during the crisis period and the growing recognition among military and civilian elites that imperial survival required more systematic approaches to succession planning and governmental organization. The accession of Diocletian in 284 CE marked the beginning of the most comprehensive reorganization of imperial government since Augustus had established the Principate nearly 3 centuries earlier. This Dalmatian officer brought to the imperial office both extensive military experience and administrative vision that enabled him to address the fundamental structural problems that had nearly destroyed Roman civilization during the preceding half-century of crisis and chaos. The tetrarchic system that Diocletian developed represented a revolutionary solution to the problem of governing territories too vast and complex for effective administration by a single ruler. The division of imperial authority among 4 emperors, with 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, created governmental structures capable of responding simultaneously to military threats and administrative challenges throughout the empire, while maintaining coordination through carefully designed institutional relationships. The geographical division of responsibilities among the tetrarchs reflected realistic assessment of the strategic and administrative requirements that imperial governance now demanded. Diocletian himself took responsibility for the eastern provinces, where Persian pressure required constant military attention, while his colleagues managed the complex challenges of defending the Rhine and Danube frontiers against increasingly sophisticated barbarian confederations that had learned to exploit Roman weaknesses through coordinated attacks and strategic penetration. The administrative reforms that Diocletian implemented throughout the empire created bureaucratic structures of unprecedented size and complexity designed to provide effective governance for populations that had grown increasingly diverse in their languages, customs, and local traditions. The separation of civilian and military authority prevented ambitious commanders from accumulating the resources and loyalties that had enabled usurpers to challenge imperial authority during the crisis period, while new hierarchical structures ensured accountability and supervision throughout governmental operations. The economic policies that characterized Diocletian's reign addressed the fiscal and monetary problems that had contributed to 3rd century instability through systematic reorganization of taxation, currency, and price regulation that aimed to restore confidence in imperial financial management. The edict on maximum prices represented an ambitious attempt to control inflation through governmental regulation, while new tax assessment procedures based on land productivity and population provided more reliable revenue sources than the chaotic arrangements that had prevailed during the crisis decades. The persecution of Christians that reached its climax during Diocletian's reign reflected both traditional Roman concerns about religious practices that seemed to threaten imperial unity and specific anxieties about a rapidly growing religious movement that questioned fundamental assumptions about divine authority and political loyalty. The systematic nature of this persecution, involving coordinated efforts throughout the empire to destroy Christian literature, buildings, and leadership, demonstrated the administrative capabilities that Diocletian's governmental reforms had created, while also revealing the extent to which Christianity had penetrated imperial society. The palace complex that Diocletian constructed at Split in Dalmatia represented both the architectural achievements that imperial resources could fund and the emperor's recognition that effective rule required secure bases removed from the political pressures and security threats that had made Rome itself an increasingly dangerous residence for imperial rulers. This massive fortified compound, combining imperial residence with military headquarters and administrative center, established precedents that would influence governmental architecture throughout the later empire. The abdication of Diocletian in 305 CE, unprecedented in Roman history, demonstrated both his personal commitment to the institutional arrangements he had created and his realistic assessment that imperial authority required regular renewal through planned succession rather than the violent transfers of power that had characterized the 3rd century crisis. His retirement to his Dalmatian palace, where he famously declared his preference for growing cabbages over governing the empire, symbolized the personal costs that effective imperial leadership imposed on individuals willing to accept its burdens. The collapse of the tetrarchic system after Diocletian's retirement revealed both the innovative character of his governmental arrangements and their dependence on the personal authority and political skill of their creator. The civil wars that erupted among his successors demonstrated that institutional reforms alone could not eliminate the fundamental tensions between the need for effective central authority and the ambitions of capable military commanders, whose careers depended on achieving positions of supreme power. The emergence of Constantine from these renewed civil wars marked another crucial transition in imperial history, as this son of a tetrarch would implement changes that transformed not only the political structure of the Roman state, but also its religious character and cultural identity. His victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, won under the sign of the Christian cross, according to his own account, began the process that would make Christianity the official religion of an empire that had persecuted it for nearly 3 centuries. The conversion of Constantine represented far more than a personal religious decision, as it reflected his sophisticated understanding of how spiritual authority could reinforce political power, while providing ideological foundations for imperial unity that transcended ethnic, linguistic, and regional divisions. His legalization of Christianity through the Edict of Milan in 313 CE created new possibilities for religious diversity, while also establishing precedents for imperial involvement in theological disputes that would influence church-state relationships throughout subsequent European history. The foundation of Constantinople as a new Eastern capital demonstrated Constantine's recognition that the empire's center of gravity had shifted toward the more prosperous and strategically crucial provinces of the eastern Mediterranean. This new city, constructed on the site of ancient Byzantium, with careful attention to both military defensibility and commercial accessibility, would become the seat of imperial power for over 1,000 years, while preserving Roman legal and administrative traditions long after the Western Empire had collapsed. And so ends the extraordinary saga of Rome, a civilization that began as a collection of hilltop villages beside the Tiber River and grew to encompass the entire known world. From the legendary she-wolf who nursed Romulus and Remus to Constantine's Christian empire spanning 3 continents, we have witnessed over 12 centuries of human ambition, triumph, and transformation on an unprecedented scale. We have seen how Rome's genius lay not just in conquest but in integration, how it absorbed the wisdom of Greece, the engineering prowess of the Etruscans, and the administrative sophistication of countless other peoples to create a civilization greater than the sum of its parts. We have watched as citizen farmers became professional soldiers, as a small republic evolved into a vast empire, and as pagan traditions gave way to Christian faith. The Roman legacy surrounds us still. Every time we drive on a highway that follows an ancient Roman road, every time we enter a courthouse where Roman legal principles guide justice, every time we use words derived from Latin or admire architecture inspired by Roman models, we encounter the enduring influence of this remarkable civilization. Rome's story reminds us that even the mightiest empires rise and fall, that human institutions require constant renewal and adaptation to survive, and that the price of greatness often includes the seeds of eventual decline. Yet it also demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human civilization to create order from chaos, beauty from brutality, and lasting achievements that transcend the mortality of their creators. As you drift into sleep, carry with you the echoes of Roman voices across the centuries, the thunder of legions on distant frontiers, and the enduring testament of a people who dared to believe they could rule the world and very nearly succeeded. Sweet dreams.